Have you ever built a multi-million-dollar empire, only to be tossed out by a suit who thinks his golf handicap equals technical skill? They thought I was just a lucky woman keeping a seat warm. They had no idea I held the single key preventing their entire server farm from bursting into flames. Grab your coffee. You are about to hear what happens when corporate arrogance meets the cold, calculated fury of a real engineer. Hello, amazing listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for your continuous support. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to operate, which means we will be forced to stop uploading new videos here for the foreseeable future as we transition our operations to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community, where you can listen to even better, longer, and incredibly detailed exclusive true stories with multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can join us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us dive right into today's story, where you will meet a woman named Haley Martin. I am Haley Martin, and at 32 years old, I was the lead data architect at Omnitransit Logistics. Omnitransit was a massive, highly competitive automated transport superconglomerate headquartered right in the freezing, wind-whipped heart of Chicago, Illinois. If you ordered a new laptop, a shipment of industrial steel, or a refrigerated container of synthetic insulin anywhere in the Midwest, it passed through our digital veins, and by our digital veins, I mean the ones I built with my own two hands. For exactly 5 years, I sat in a climate-controlled glass box overlooking a sea of humming server racks, acting as the undisputed queen of the grid. I wrote the core routing algorithm from scratch. It was an intricate, flawless piece of architecture that allowed our server clusters to process literally millions of orders every single day with absolute zero latency. I am not talking about 99% uptime. I am talking about perfection. My code was a living, breathing symphony that balanced thermal loads, rerouted around regional power outages in milliseconds, and kept the company printing cash while the executives slept soundly in their suburban mansions. I was a ghost in the machine, and I liked it that way. I was paid well, respected by the engineering team, and left alone to do what I did best. Then came Blake Sterling. Blake was the newly minted vice president of operations. How did he get there? Certainly not through merit or a fundamental understanding of automated supply chain logistics. Blake got his corner office because he was a legacy fraternity brother of the chief executive officer, possessed a freshly printed Master of Business Administration from a school his father donated a library to, and had a golf handicap that made the board of directors swoon. He was a walking billboard for corporate nepotism, impeccably dressed in custom Italian suits, smelling of expensive cologne and unearned confidence. The man did not know the difference between a solid-state drive and a cup of coffee, but he sure knew how to use words like synergy, paradigm shift, and lean optimization. From the very first day he stepped onto the engineering floor, Blake made his disdain for me incredibly apparent. To him, the tech department was just a cost center, and I was just an anomaly he could not comprehend. He could not stand the fact that a woman in her early 30s held the master keys to the entire operation. He started small, dropping little passive-aggressive bombs during high-stakes board meetings. Whenever I presented data on server loads or thermal dynamics, he would cut me off with a condescending smirk. "Let us not get bogged down in the nerdy details, girl," Blake would say, leaning back in his leather chair and steepling his fingers. "We need to focus on the big picture. You just keep the blinking lights green and leave the heavy logistics to the men in the room." He actually used the word girl repeatedly in front of the entire executive board. He openly and loudly questioned my ability to handle the pressure of our peak seasons, suggesting that my cautious approach to server stress management was overly emotional. But Blake did not stop at boardroom insults. He decided he needed to put his own stamp on my department to justify his massive salary. 2 weeks into his tenure, Blake marched into my server domain leading a parade of what he called strategic consultants. In reality, They were a pack of 20-something slick-haired boys fresh out of business school. None of them had ever written a single line of production code in their lives. They carried sleek tablets and wore matching smirk and suit combos, trailing behind Blake like ducklings following a very arrogant mother duck. Blake announced that this team was going to conduct a comprehensive audit of my entire routing system to find efficiencies. I watched in silent disbelief as these kids scrutinized the fail-safe protocols I had meticulously designed to prevent server fires and catastrophic data loss. They pointed at my thermal throttling algorithms and laughed. "This is highly inefficient," one of the boys declared, tapping his stylus against the screen. "You have layers of redundancy here that throttle the processing speed by at least 2%. It is overly defensive." Blake nodded sagely, placing a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder. "You see, Haley, this is exactly what I was talking about. This architecture is full of female timidity and sluggishness. You are too scared of breaking things to truly innovate. We need an aggressive, masculine approach to data processing. We need to push these servers to their absolute limits, not coddle them like fragile infants." I gently shrugged his hand off my shoulder, keeping my face completely passive. Inside, a cold, calculating fury was beginning to crystallize. They were looking at safety valves and calling them weakness. They were looking at the very mechanisms keeping Omni-Transit from a catastrophic meltdown and labeling them timid. They had absolutely no idea that my timid code was the only thing standing between their multi-million-dollar bonuses and a complete operational apocalypse. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear. I just smiled, looked Blake dead in the eye, and quietly prepared for war. The systematic dismantling of my authority did not happen overnight in a dramatic confrontation. It was a slow, deliberate strangulation, executed through a series of bureaucratic maneuvers designed to push me out into the cold. First, Blake started revoking my root access to the central server cluster. I would log into my workstation on a Tuesday morning only to discover that my security clearance level had been silently downgraded. When I sent an inquiry, the Human Resources Department replied with a generic, automated email about departmental protocol realignment, but the real, visceral insult was discovering exactly who received my administrative keys. His name was Chad. Chad was a junior system administrator who spent 90% of his workday watching fantasy football highlights and eating strong-smelling corn chips at his desk, exactly 2 years prior. Chad had single-handedly taken down our entire internal corporate network because he tried to download a pirated version of an expensive video editing suite and accidentally unleashed a vicious ransomware worm into our local drives. He was incompetent, lazy, and utterly unqualified to manage a basic home wireless network, let alone a multi-million-dollar automated logistics grid. But Chad possessed one crucial qualification that I lacked. He was a man who laughed obnoxiously at Blake's terrible jokes, eagerly fetched his dry cleaning, and never questioned a single order. Within a month of Blake arriving, Chad was promoted to lead grid supervisor. It was a title Blake literally invented out of thin air, just to place a layer of male authority directly above me. I, the architect of the entire system, was suddenly forced to submit routine change requests to a guy who frequently had to ask me how to reset his own email password. The real danger, however, began when Blake set his sights on my thermal and traffic routing algorithms. My code was a bespoke masterpiece, custom-built for the unique physical realities of the Omni-Transit warehouse. It was designed to intuitively shift processing loads across thousands of individual servers, preventing hardware from overheating during massive spikes in order volume. It was the invisible shield keeping the multi-million-dollar hardware from melting down into expensive slag. Blake, in his infinite wisdom, decided my architecture was too convoluted and lacked visual appeal for the investors. During an all-hands meeting, he proudly announced that we were immediately transitioning to a new, state-of-the-art logistics management suite called Apex Flow. I immediately ran a background check on the vendor. Apex Flow was not a legitimate enterprise software company with a proven track record. It was a shell corporation registered in Delaware, Owned entirely by one of Blake's old fraternity brothers from his university days, the software itself was a flashy, resource-heavy, off-the-shelf nightmare. It featured a beautiful, colorful user interface designed to impress board members, but it possessed absolutely zero structural integrity under the hood. It was cheap, dangerous garbage wrapped in expensive marketing jargon, and Omnitransit paid $2.5 million for the exclusive licensing rights. Every time I attempted to bring up valid technical concerns about this software, Blake would employ the exact same brand of weaponized sexism to shut me down. It was a daily, exhausting barrage of microaggressions, a psychological death by 1,000 cuts. He would talk over me in meetings, physically blocking my line of sight to the projector. He would listen to my technical warnings, rephrase them poorly, and then present them to the board as his own brilliant insights. He constantly referred to the heavy server hardware as big boy toys, implying that the physical reality of the machines was simply too gritty for my delicate female sensibilities. If I was firm and direct about a security flaw, he called me difficult to work with. If I remained quiet to avoid a public argument, he noted my lack of cooperative team spirit. The absolute breaking point arrived in late October, just 3 weeks before the catastrophic surge of the holiday shipping season. I spent 4 sleepless nights compiling a rigorous, 40-page diagnostic report. I ran dozens of simulations running the new Apex Flow software against our projected holiday order volume. The data was glaring and undeniable. Without my dynamic thermal routing acting as a buffer, the cheap new software would aggressively push the primary server cluster far past its physical thermal limits. The hardware would overheat, the cooling units would fail to keep up, and the fail-safes would trigger a hard, unrecoverable shutdown. I brought this printed report directly into Blake's corner office. I laid the heavy stack of charts on his polished mahogany desk and explained, calmly and with absolute clarity, that we were looking at a complete, catastrophic system failure during the most profitable 3 weeks of the fiscal year. Blake did not even bother to open the folder. He leaned back in his expensive ergonomic chair, folded his hands behind his head, and sighed loudly, looking at me with profound pity. "Haley," he said, using that slow, soothing, patronizing tone one might use to calm a hysterical toddler, "you are doing it again. You are getting overly emotional and catastrophizing a simple software transition because you are too attached to your old way of doing things. Change is hard for you. I get it, but you really need to stop letting your personal feelings cloud your professional judgment. Chad assures me the new system is humming along perfectly. Just take a deep breath, step back, and let the men handle the pressure of the peak season." He called me emotional. He told me to take a deep breath. A lesser professional might have screamed at him. A different woman might have stormed out of the office, threatened to quit on the spot, or filed a completely useless grievance with a human resources department that was already sitting comfortably in Blake's back pocket. I did none of those things. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice a fraction of a decibel. I simply picked up my 40-page report, offered him a cold, perfectly polite smile, and said, "Understood. Blake, I will leave the hardware entirely in your capable hands." I walked back to my desk, sat down in my chair, and immediately created a heavily encrypted, off-site digital logbook. I privately named the file the autopsy report. Into this secure digital vault, I began meticulously documenting every single directive Blake issued. I saved the internal emails where he explicitly ordered the decommissioning of my safety protocols. I recorded the exact system timestamps, the network access logs, and the specific administrative commands that Chad executed under Blake's direct supervision. I built an airtight, mathematically undeniable paper trail of their monumental arrogance and stupidity. Then, I began the highly delicate process of weaning the system. Over the 5 years I spent building the Omnitransit grid, I had integrated thousands of lines of my own proprietary code into the mainframe. These were custom scripts and dynamic thermal patches that I had coded on my own personal time, which I owned the absolute legal copyright to. I had generously allowed the corporation to use them for free simply because I cared deeply about the integrity of the network I had built. But since Blake had officially declared my methods obsolete and officially transitioned the company to his buddy's inferior software, I was no longer legally, contractually, or ethically obligated to leave my personal intellectual property running on their servers. Over the next 14 days, I worked late into the night, masking my digital footprints. I systematically and quietly stripped every single line of my custom protective algorithms out of the central architecture. I removed the automated thermal baffles. I deleted the emergency load balancing scripts. I uninstalled the predictive weather routing modules. I was not hacking them. I was not planting a virus or sabotaging a single piece of company property. I was simply, quietly, and legally packing up my own personal tools. By the time I was finished, the OmniTransit server farm was running entirely on Blake's prized Apex Flow software. It was completely naked, mathematically blind, and utterly defenseless against the incoming storm of the holiday season. I was watching them build a fragile house of cards on top of an active volcano, and I was making absolutely sure to take my fire extinguisher home with me. It arrived on a Wednesday morning at exactly 9:14. I was staring at a line of routing code when a calendar invitation popped up on my secondary monitor. It was from the Director of Human Resources, requesting my presence for a mandatory meeting scheduled for Friday at 4 in the afternoon. The subject line consisted of 4 carefully chosen words: Personnel Structure Optimization Review. In the corporate world, especially within the cutthroat environment of a logistics empire like OmniTransit, a Friday afternoon meeting with the Human Resources Department featuring the word optimization is never a brainstorming session. It is a scheduled execution. They were going to fire me. I did not gasp. My pulse did not quicken. I simply took a slow sip of my black coffee, feeling the warm caffeine settle in my chest, and calmly clicked the accept button. I had exactly 48 hours left on the inside. I want to be perfectly clear about what happened during those final 2 days. If you're expecting a story about a disgruntled employee writing a malicious virus, deploying a logic bomb, or planting a destructive Trojan horse deep within the mainframe, you will be disappointed. Sabotage is a federal crime, and I am a meticulous professional. What I did was much colder and entirely legal. I simply adhered to the absolute as strict letter of my employment contract. Over the years, to ensure the server farm ran flawlessly, I had quietly linked our central routing hub to several premium, third-party data streams. I used my own personal developer application programming interface keys to pull real-time meteorological data, predictive weather patterns, and interstate traffic grid analytics. I paid the hefty monthly subscription fees for those data feeds out of my own pocket because the corporate procurement process was notoriously slow, and I demanded perfection from my system. Since Blake had declared my methods obsolete, and since I was about to be optimized right out of the building, providing free enterprise-grade data to a billion-dollar company was no longer my responsibility. Methodically, shrouded in the quiet hum of the server room beneath my feet, I opened the core directory. I highlighted my personal encrypted strings. I pressed the delete key. One by one, I severed the server farm's sensory connection to the outside world. Without those keys, Blake's precious new software would be entirely blind. It would not know if a massive blizzard was shutting down the highways of Wisconsin, or if a severe heat wave was melting the asphalt in Texas. It would just route trucks blindly into the void based on static, useless assumptions. It was not sabotage. It was simply the abrupt withdrawal of my personal charity. Next came the most critical phase of my departure. While I had already uninstalled my proprietary thermal management software from the main cluster, I had left a localized, temporary bridge script running silently in the background. It was a simple automation designed to keep the old cooling protocols limping along during the transition to Blake's new system, purely to prevent an immediate hardware fire while I was still legally liable as the lead data architect. But a temporary bridge is not meant to last forever. I opened the root command terminal and modified the conditional parameters of that final script. I coded a dead man's switch. The logic was beautiful in its absolute simplicity. I tied the execution of that thermal safety bridge directly to the physical security grid of the Chicago headquarters. The cooling system would only remain active on the condition that my specific employee identification badge was physically swiped at the main lobby turnstiles at least once every 24 hours. As long as I was a verified, active employee walking into that building, the servers would stay comfortably chilled. The exact second my badge was deactivated by the Human Resources Department, the bridge would instantly dissolve. The servers would be left entirely at the mercy of Blake and his shiny, incompetent new software. With the digital architecture settled, I turned my attention to the physical world. Over the next 48 hours, I slowly and invisibly erased my existence from my office. I took home my custom ergonomic keyboard on Thursday evening. I packed up my framed university credentials, my collection of vintage motherboard schematics, and my favorite ceramic coffee mug. I left the desk completely barren, wiped clean of any personal trace, leaving behind only the cheap plastic mouse and the standard issue monitor that legally belonged to Omnitransit. On Friday at 3:45 in the afternoon, exactly 15 minutes before my scheduled termination, I drafted one final email. I addressed it to the internal administrative system log, carbon copying the central network monitoring inbox. The message was brief, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. Notice of system transition completion. All proprietary safety protocols linked to user H.Martin have been successfully uncoupled. Primary thermal load management and regional routing are now solely dependent on the Apex Flow suite, as directed by the Vice President of Operations. Good luck. I did not click send. Instead, I attached the email to an automated chronological job script. I programmed the server to hold the message in the outbox and release it the exact millisecond my network credentials were changed from active to terminated. I locked my workstation screen for the last time, stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my blazer, and walked down the long, fluorescent-lit hallway toward the Human Resources Department. The chessboard was set, and it was time to let them make their final, fatal move. I walked into Conference Room B at exactly 4 in the afternoon. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and cheap vanilla air freshener, the standard scent of corporate bureaucracy. Seated at the far end of the long glass table was the Director of Human Resources. Let us call her Brenda. Brenda was a woman whose entire personality seemed constructed from generic motivational posters and company handbooks. Beside her sat Blake, his legs crossed casually at the knee, wearing a custom navy suit and a grin so wide it could have swallowed a cargo ship. "Haley, please take a seat," Brenda said, gesturing with a perfectly manicured hand. "We are here today to discuss a strategic realignment of our technological assets." Strategic realignment, the corporate translation for pushing someone off a cliff. I sat down, folded my hands neatly in my lap, and let her speak. Brenda launched into a deeply rehearsed, agonizingly slow monologue filled with empty buzzwords. She talked for what felt like 10 minutes about shifting paradigms, leveraging new synergies, and pivoting toward a more robust operational model for the upcoming fiscal quarter. "To be perfectly frank, Haley," Brenda continued, lowering her voice into an artificial tone of deep, practiced sympathy, "the executive board feels that as we scale up our logistics grid, we require a different kind of leadership in the data department. We need a more assertive, frankly, a more masculine energy to drive these aggressive new growth targets. Your cautious approach has been appreciated over the past 5 years, but we are moving into a highly competitive phase that requires bold, fearless execution." I did not blink. A masculine energy, they were actually putting it on the record, coded in just enough human resources jargon to make it legally defensible in their own minds. They were firing the architect of their entire network because I did not possess the right gender to oversee my own creation. Blake uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the glass table. The smugness radiating from him was a physical force in the room. "Look, Haley, no hard feelings," he said, offering a deeply patronizing half-smile. "You built a nice little foundation here, but let us be real with each other. We upgraded the software. The Apex Flow suite is online, and the system basically runs itself smoothly now. We just do not need a sensitive nanny hovering over the servers anymore, constantly worrying about temperatures and traffic jams. We need commanders, not caretakers. He pushed a thick manila folder across the smooth glass surface. This is your standard separation agreement. We are offering you a generous severance package of 60 days' pay, provided you sign the non-disclosure agreement. We have also included a pamphlet for outplacement services to help you find a smaller company, perhaps a position more suited to your specific emotional temperament. They expected tears. They expected me to raise my voice, to defend my technical legacy, or to desperately beg for my job. Blake was practically leaning out of his chair, waiting to drink in my despair. Instead, I reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out my own heavy silver fountain pen, and opened the folder. I did not even glance at the ridiculous outplacement pamphlet. I flipped directly to the signature page of the termination agreement. I will not be needing the career counseling, I said, my voice perfectly level, soft, and entirely pleasant. But I do appreciate the 60 days of paid vacation. I signed my name in a smooth, elegant script, capped my pen, and pushed the heavy folder back across the table. Blake's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. My absolute lack of resistance confused him. He had come heavily armed for a loud battle of egos, and I had simply handed him the keys to a rigged explosive. "Well," Brenda stammered, visibly thrown off her carefully rehearsed script by my cheerful compliance. "That makes things incredibly easy. We just need your security badge and your company smartphone." I placed the plastic access card and the mobile device on the table. They made a soft, final click against the glass. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket. "It has been an absolute education working with you both," I said, looking directly into Blake's eyes. "I truly wish you all the luck in the world with your new, dynamic energy. You are going to need every single ounce of it." I turned and walked out of conference room B. I did not look back. I strode down the long, carpeted corridor, past the rows of glass cubicles where my former colleagues were busy wrapping up their Friday afternoon tasks, completely oblivious to the ticking time bombs sitting directly beneath their feet. I stepped into the main lobby, the polished marble floors echoing loudly under my heels. The security guard at the front desk gave me a polite nod, totally unaware that he was watching the sole protector of the building's central nervous system walk out the door for the final time. I pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors and stepped out into the crisp, biting wind of the Chicago afternoon. I took a deep, freezing breath of absolute freedom. Behind me, up in their warm glass tower, Blake and Brenda were undoubtedly congratulating themselves on a flawless execution, entirely blind to the fact that they had just enthusiastically dug their own corporate graves. At that exact second, the heavy glass door locked into place behind me. The lobby security scanner registered that my badge was no longer physically present inside the perimeter, upstairs, in the Human Resources database. Brenda clicked a button that officially changed my employment status from active to terminated. Deep underground, in the freezing darkness of the central server farm, a silent digital event occurred. The physical location ping failed. The dead man's switch I had programmed 48 hours ago checked the condition, found it unequivocally false, and triggered the final command. The master has left. The invisible shield dissolved into nothing. The automated email fired from my outbox directly to the internal logs. The thermal baffles clicked off. The cooling bridge collapsed. The entire omni-transit logistics empire was now left completely naked, resting entirely in Blake's utterly incompetent hands. The weekend passed in absolute, eerie silence, giving the executives a false sense of total victory. But Monday morning arrived with the subtlety of a runaway freight train derailing at maximum speed. At exactly 6 a.m, the peak holiday shipping surge hit the Omni-Transit network like a tidal wave hitting a paper wall. Millions of individual logistics requests, shipping manifests, and tracking updates flooded the central system within a matter of minutes. Apex Flow, the shiny $2.5 million software suite Blake had championed, immediately buckled under the sheer, crushing weight of the data. Blinded by the deliberate absence of my external application programming interface keys, the software began making terrifying, logicless decisions at a terrifying speed. By 8 in the morning, the system was actively misrouting tens of thousands of packages. The precision I had built was replaced by absolute digital madness. An entire convoy of specialized refrigerated trucks carrying highly sensitive frozen organic produce was confidently directed away from the snowy Midwest and sent barreling straight toward the scorching heat of the Nevada desert. A massive shipment of delicate surgical equipment bound for a top-tier hospital in Boston was inexplicably rerouted to a scrap metal recycling facility in rural Ohio. 30 fully loaded transport planes were grounded on the tarmac because their digital flight manifests simply vanished into thin air. Down on the main warehouse floor, thousands of automated sorting robots suddenly stopped dead in their tracks. Their internal navigation systems completely blinded. They crashed into each other at high speeds, spilling hundreds of thousands of parcels across the concrete. The system was not just failing, it was actively hallucinating. But the digital chaos was absolutely nothing compared to the physical catastrophe unfolding deep underground. Without my custom thermal load balancing algorithms to dynamically shift the processing weight, Apex Flow simply crammed every single incoming data request into the primary server cluster. The hardware was immediately pushed past 100% capacity. The processors began to generate a massive, localized heat wave. With my dead man switch having permanently disabled the automated cooling bridge on Friday afternoon, the ambient temperature in the secured server room skyrocketed. It climbed from a safe 68 degrees to 90 degrees, then pushed past 120 degrees in a matter of minutes. The heavy industrial cooling fans screamed like dying jet engines, but they were only blowing boiling hot air back onto melting silicon. Sometime around 9:15 in the morning, the heavy plastic casing on rack unit 4 melted completely, dripping directly onto an exposed, hyperactive motherboard. A spark caught. Thick, acrid black smoke began pouring from the server racks, filling the room with the toxic stench of burning plastic and fried circuitry. The automated fire suppression system shrieked to life, raining highly pressurized chemical foam down onto millions of dollars of completely unprotected, uninsured hardware. The massive electrical short caused a cascading power surge that violently tripped the main breakers for the entire facility. The lights flickered frantically and died. The entire Chicago warehouse grid, a state-of-the-art facility the size of 4 football fields, plunged into absolute darkness and deafening silence. Up in the executive suite, the illusion of control shattered instantly. Blake was standing in his plush corner office, staring in absolute horror at his massive monitor as the beautifully designed Apex Flow dashboard flashed violently in warning colors before going completely black. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized his chest. He grabbed his desk phone and frantically dialed Chad. Down in the darkened grid control room, illuminated only by the harsh red glow of emergency backup lights, Chad was practically hyperventilating. Blake screamed through the phone receiver, his voice cracking, demanding that Chad manually override the routing tables and force an emergency reboot of the cooling systems immediately. But Chad, the junior administrator who had built his entire career on fetching coffee and laughing at the right jokes, was completely paralyzed. His trembling fingers pounded across his keyboard, but every single command he typed was aggressively rejected by the terminal. He stammered into the phone, tears welling in his eyes, that he could not access the terminal. Blake had handed him an impressive administrative title, but neither of them possessed the actual, deeply buried root passwords required to access the underlying core of the system. I had taken the master keys with me, and they were staring at a locked titanium vault with nothing but a plastic toothpick. The financial hemorrhage was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The damage ticker on the executive dashboard, before the monitors completely lost their connection, showed losses accumulating at an astronomical rate of $3 million every single hour. And that figure did not even begin to account for the catastrophic damage to the company's reputation. By 10 in the morning, the corporate switchboard was entirely overwhelmed. Omnitransit's largest clients, massive pharmaceutical conglomerates and multinational retail giants, were calling furiously, demanding to know why their fleets were driving in circles or sitting completely dead on the highways. Highly paid legal departments were already drafting aggressive breach of contract lawsuits, threatening to bury the logistics company in decades of litigation. The board of directors, previously so charmed by Blake and his perfectly tailored suits, was now swarming the executive floor like a hive of violently disturbed hornets. Their stock options were actively vaporizing before their eyes, and they wanted blood. The absolute peak of the disaster occurred when the chief executive officer himself, a man who rarely left the quiet comfort of the top floor, bypassed the screaming board members and sprinted directly down to the server room. He kicked open the heavy security doors, coughing violently as the lingering black smoke stung his eyes and throat. He found Blake and Chad standing over a single, surviving backup diagnostic terminal that was running on emergency battery power. Blake was sweating profusely, his expensive suit wrinkled and smelling of pure fear, desperately barking incoherent, meaningless orders at a weeping Chad. The chief executive officer shoved Blake aside with brutal force and stared directly at the glowing screen. He demanded a clear, simple explanation for why the beating heart of his billion-dollar logistics empire was currently melting into the concrete floor. Blake opened his mouth to spout another string of meaningless business jargon about synergies and unexpected paradigms, but the screen answered for him. There were no complex diagnostic charts, no fancy colorful graphics from the Apex Flow software. There was only the stark, blinking green text of the foundational operating system, displaying a single, continuous error message looping endlessly across the monitor. System failure, critical overheating detected, manual override denied, missing root access from author H. Martin. My personal mobile phone vibrated on the small wooden table next to my lounge chair. I picked it up, shielding the screen from the bright afternoon sun of the Caribbean coast. The caller identification displayed a panicked, heavily breathing chief executive officer of Omnitransit Logistics. I took a slow, refreshing sip of my iced mango margarita and pressed answer. "Haley, please, you have to come back." His voice crackled through the speaker, completely stripped of the arrogant corporate distance he usually maintained. He sounded like a man standing on the edge of a very high cliff. "I will give you 3 times your previous salary. I will create a permanent seat for you on the board of directors. You can have absolute, unchecked control over the entire engineering division. Just please, log in and fix the servers. We are bleeding millions." I listened to the frantic sound of alarms echoing in the background of his call. "I am afraid that is impossible," I replied, my voice as calm as the ocean waves breaking on the sand in front of me. "I do not work for you anymore, but even if I did, you are completely misunderstanding the situation. The system overheating is actually the least of your current problems." I heard a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I decided to generously explain the final, hidden layer of my architecture. "You see," I continued, "when I began auditing Blake's precious Apex Flow software 2 weeks ago, I did not just find terrible coding and thermal inefficiencies. I found a highly sophisticated financial backdoor. His fraternity brother's shell company was not just providing a terrible logistics interface. The software was actively skimming fractional cents off every single automated transaction and routing those micropayments into offshore accounts. Blake was using your server farm to systematically embezzle millions of dollars directly under your nose." The chief executive officer gasped, a sharp, ragged sound. "My proprietary security protocols were so aggressive," I explained smoothly, "that they were inadvertently masking his illegal data traffic from the federal banking monitors. But when you fired me, and my dead man switch uninstalled all of my custom safety algorithms, it did not just leave the servers vulnerable to the heat. It stripped away Blake's camouflage. For the last 4 hours, your network has been broadcasting his raw, unfiltered embezzlement data directly to the open internet." Back in Chicago, exactly as I spoke those words, the grand finale was unfolding in real time. Blake was standing in the middle of the chaotic executive floor, aggressively pointing his finger at a terrified human resources director, loudly claiming that I was a malicious hacker who had planted a virus to destroy the company. He was right in the middle of demanding that legal press federal charges against me when the elevator doors chimed and slid open. A dozen agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, wearing dark navy windbreakers with stark yellow lettering, flooded onto the executive floor. They were not there because of a server crash. They were there because the second my employee badge was deactivated on Friday. My automated autopsy report did not just go to the internal company logs. A fully decrypted, mathematically undeniable copy of every single one of Blake's shady directives, network logs, and the Apex Flow financial backdoor architecture was instantly emailed to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Blake's arrogant, smug demeanor evaporated the instant cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around his perfectly manicured wrists. He was arrested right there on the stained, smoke-smelling carpet for massive corporate fraud and wire theft, crying and begging for his lawyer as they dragged him toward the elevators. The chief executive officer dropped his phone, sinking to his knees in the middle of the server room ash, watching helplessly as the company stock ticker on a surviving monitor violently plummeted by a staggering 60% in a single morning. Omni-Transit was functionally dead. As for me, I finished my vacation, packed my bags, and flew back to the city. I did not need their outplacement pamphlet. Within 48 hours of the Omni-Transit collapse, their largest, most vicious competitor called me. I walked into their headquarters on a Monday, not as a data architect, but as their newly appointed Chief Technology Officer. I am currently building them a brand new, completely untouchable automated logistics grid from the ground up. The corporate world learned a very harsh, very expensive lesson that week. They finally realized that women in this industry do not just have the capability to touch the heavy hardware. We hold the absolute power to decide exactly who is allowed to survive the game. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Amazing listeners. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. As I mentioned earlier, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep producing content here. We will absolutely not be uploading new videos on this platform for the foreseeable future. If you thought today's story was great and you want to hear more, please help us survive by moving over to our Patreon community. Over there, you will get access to the absolute best, most intense, and exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen, or by clicking the link in the video description or the pinned comment. We cannot wait to see you there.